Okay, good morning. My name is Michael Kende. I'm a senior fellow at the Graduate Institute, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Data 2025 conference. Last year was the 50th anniversary of the first moon landing, and among all the articles celebrating that was one that was comparing the computer on board the Apollo 11 to an iPhone. In some ways, it's not a fair comparison. The computer on the Apollo 11 weighed about 70 pounds, was far, far more expensive than the iPhone. And the iPhone had at least 100,000 times the processing power of the computer that was used to land them on the moon, and 7 million times more data storage. The article was obviously meant to illustrate what a technological feat the moon landing was with such a primitive computer, and it clearly was. But it really also demonstrates the pace of change. How much data can be generated, processed, and stored just in our pockets about every one of our movements, whether we've been in contact with someone who has COVID, where we're going, where we've been. And all that data is aggregated, analyzed, and distributed for use in ways we may know and in ways we probably don't know. So we need to understand how to govern this explosion of data today and start looking toward 2025, and that's the purpose of this conference. The conference has been co-organized between the Graduate Institute and the EPFL, and I'm very happy that the heads of both institutions are with us to speak during this opening session, along with my colleague, Professor Richard Baldwin at the Graduate Institute. So now it's a great pleasure for me to introduce the director of the Graduate Institute, Marie-Laure Salles, to give our welcoming remarks. Marie-Laure?
Thank you very much, Michael. Good morning. Warm welcome to all of you to the Graduate Institute and to the Maison de la Paix, at least in virtual form, for this full day of discussions on data, its nature, role, challenges, and necessary governance in our world. Like many of you, I wish we could have been having this discussion in a physical setting, disconnecting thus the substance of the debate from its form, and taking advantage of what a digital data world still cannot, and I hope will never be able to displace. The thickness of debate when it is lived and experienced in a physical setting, the importance of visual and gesture cues, of all those forms of human exchanges that happen when human beings are co-located in the same place, the sense of society and of belonging that emerges from being together and debating back and forth, and this even if we disagree. The informal parts of those meetings, the coffee breaks, even the bathroom lines, and the connections that get created and will lead to all kinds of serendipitous developments. I'm sure that we will be back there again. At least we should fight for that. In the meantime, it's indeed wonderful that we have the means today to make that event happen in spite of it all. By the power of technology and in spite of a global pandemic, we are all together today to discuss the all-important issues around data, issues that the COVID period is making particularly acute, but that existed before and will remain after the COVID moment. Beyond the sheer possibility of holding an event that was cancelled in the real world, we should also recognize the opportunity that this online version represents, in particular the opportunity to reach well beyond our ordinary audiences. Let me give some proper thank yous for that. Thank you to our friends from EPFL with whom we partner on this event. I'm delighted of that. Thank you, dear Martin, for your presence with us this morning and your willingness to give the keynote. Thank you, Jean-Pierre Hubault, Olivier Crochat, and Ria Keshagia for all your work in co-organizing the event. At the Institute, I would like to thank Michael Kende and Richard Baldwin, as well as Tamara Pironet and Michael Omumwa, for all the energies that they put into organizing the event. And I know that this energy was intense. More generally, let me say how delighted I am to see this kind of collaboration between the Institute and EPFL on topics such as data, opportunities and risks of digitalization, internet and its governance. It is quite clear that we need to create spaces of collaboration, discussion, co-construction between science and technology on the one hand, and social and human sciences on the other. It's only if we take this interface seriously that we can move towards a digitalized society that does not veer into radical dystopia and provides us instead with the necessary tools for an economy and a society that should be more sustainable and more inclusive. It's only if we take this interface seriously that we can steer technology to the service of humanity and avoid what otherwise could be indeed a radical techlash and or the very destruction of what humanity is all about, the social, the emotional, our multiple senses and their expressions, freedom, critical thinking. Let me also underscore how those opportunities and challenges, those avenues for radical progress on the one hand or radical threats on the other, are all by nature transnational. Hence the particular role an intellectual hub like the Graduate Institute can and should play in the exploration of those questions. When I see the program, I only wish I could stay for the entire day, which unfortunately I won't be able to do. I wish you all very rich and productive discussions, and I'm really looking forward to a continuing collaboration between our two institutions on those issues of urgent importance. Beyond Tech for Good, we should work together towards a more ambitious horizon, what I like to call good in tech. This horizon is impossible without the type of broad and deep interdisciplinarity that a collaboration between our institution would allow. The prospect is very inspiring, at least to me. Thank you very much. And I'm now handing it over to Richard Baldwin. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Marie-Laure. My name is Richard Baldwin. I'm a professor of international economics here at the Graduate Institute on the sort of social science side. And I am enormously pleased to invite you to this first manifestation of an idea that Martin Vetterli and I came up with in January 2019. I remember the moment of creation. It was in Davos at Geneva night, just after Brad Smith, president of Microsoft, had given an address calling for global governance based in Switzerland for digital things. 2 points. First, it was a business guy calling for governance, not a politician, not a scholar. And I think it was because they are at the cutting edge of what digital technology and data is doing to our societies and with our societies and for our societies. And business without governance rarely ends well. Second, Martin and I had to travel all the way to Davos to talk about this idea, even though we actually live relatively close to each other. That's because academics tend to live in silos. That's how we are rewarded in our profession, to become experts in one thing. But that is not how we're going to solve the world's problems, whether it's data governance or digital or climate change. We have to break down those silos. I hope today's proceedings are the beginning of a long and fruitful cooperation between hard sciences and social sciences on a substantive level, and the Graduate Institute and EPFL on an institutional level. And I hope that cooperation, first of all, breaks down the silos, and second, advances global governance for the benefit of all. Getting the governance right requires insights from hard science, because generally speaking, the people making the laws do not understand the technology. And it requires insights from social science, because the people inventing and deploying the technology are often oblivious to or ignorant of the social, political, and economic implications of the things they're doing. Getting governance right is why I hope today is not so much an event, but the beginning of a process. With that, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Martin Vetterli, who is president of EPFL. As a scholar, he made his most important contributions in digital signaling processing, which more or less means separating the news from the noise, looking at a complex world and seeing what's important. More recently, he's been using that skill more broadly, first as the president of the Research Council for the Swiss National Foundation, and since 2017 as president of EPFL. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, let me just share my screen, if I may. Just a sec, share screen, if I'm allowed to, that is. And, okay, and a few clicks away, and I think here we are. Okay, so first, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Marie-Laure, whom I haven't met in person, but we had a very delightful conversation a couple of weeks ago. Welcome to the region, Marie-Laure. It's a fantastic region, a lot of opportunities. Thank you, Richard, for the kind introduction. Yeah, I do remember that talk. We have to go to Davos to meet people that are neighbors, but maybe that's what it takes. But important point is that we met and we discussed, and we have interesting things going on. And this one certainly, this event is certainly super interesting for an interaction between what I would call a social science and humanities school that you guys run in Geneva, super interesting, super visible, and an institute of technology that is based on natural sciences and engineering sciences, and tries to develop tools for a better world. But sometimes when things go wrong, as we know, and I'll talk a little bit about it, we feel a little bit bad about the tools we actually have developed. And that's where the connection to social sciences and humanities is absolutely central. So let me get going. So what am I going to talk about? Well, I'll give the standard introduction. What is the problem, with a few examples. I'm sure you're very familiar with them, but I'll quickly go through them. I'll briefly talk about how EPFL deals with data and digitalization in general. And then the two key things is I'm going to talk about trust, in particular digital trust. And I know there are several sessions where people intervene on that topic, and of course about data governance. And I'll give a few examples to round this all off. Okay, so let's go back in history. So 2,500 years ago, the founder of what is now the discipline of medicine, Hippocrates, said, "All that may come to my knowledge in the exercise of my profession or in daily commerce with man, which ought not to be spread abroad, I will keep secret and will never reveal." It is interesting that this was said by a medical doctor, and that maybe one of the touchiest topics is what to do about medical data, how to put it to good use while not throwing away the baby with the bathwater. Well, what is the situation today? This is my favorite cartoonist, Chapat, also from Geneva, showing us how our friend Mark Zuckerberg deals with what Hippocrates was talking about. I think this summarizes the whole problem we have with the GAFAMs in general, and with this particular one, of course. And this is also why we're on the table today to discuss about this. And truly, the fact that the president of Microsoft, Brad Smith, I'll come back to his initiatives, that Brad Smith, as a representative of a for-profit corporation, says, please, we need more governance, is a clear sign that we went maybe not always the right path. That sort of news, bias in analysis of data, Google playing with our health data, Facebook I mentioned, cyber attacks, data leaks, etc. This is almost every day in the news. And the fact that it's so central certainly is also linked to the fact that we spent 2020 mostly online. I like this one, you might have seen it. The kid with the president of the US. The kid says, Dad says, you're spying us online. Obama answers, he's not your dad. I think this exactly puts it to the point. And that all the GAFAMs had essentially signed backdoor deals with NSA, CIA, and so on. And probably these deals are still going on as we speak. Somebody at NSA is actually detecting the word NSA as I speak in this talk or on my mobile phone, and probably following and checking what I'm actually doing. Oh, well, so what does EPFL do in this domain? I like also this meme. There's question is, who led the digital transformation of your company in 2020? Is it the CEO? Is it the CTO, the IT specialist, or COVID-19? And truly, EPFL, which is an institute of technology, fairly well set up, well funded, and so on. I have to very much admit that on March 16, when we said let's go online, which we did relatively easily because we are very present in online teaching to begin with, there were a lot of administrative processes where I had been told for the last 3 years it was very hard to get rid of paper, and magically they went online. Okay. All right. So what do we do at EPFL? Well, we're very involved in education, of course, using digital tools, but also educating people in data science and the likes. I'll come back to this. Of course, as an institute of technology, we're very involved in research related to data, AI, machine learning. And as an institute of technology, very interested in innovation, in startups, in relationship with industrial partners. We, of course, look at new business models related to digitalization. I take just a few examples. We have 2 new masters related to the topic we discussed today. One in data science, super popular, another one in cybersecurity. We run together with our sister institution, ETH in Zurich. We have continuing education, several forms, online, of course, and we have centers around the questions we discussed today. The Center for Digital Trust, and the academic director and the executive director, Jean-Pierre Hubot and Olivier Crochat, are actually part of the proceedings today. And we have, research centers in AI, the Center for Intelligent Systems, and one purely on data science, which we run together with our sister institution, and has an academic co-director, Ed Bugnon, who is also a speaker today. I think he's closing the day at the end this afternoon. Okay, trust. My favorite example of trust is, of course, the rice stones. It's an example that colleagues of mine at EPFL showed me. It's a method of payments that was used over several hundred years. Well, it's somewhat clunky. This particular stone weighs, I think, 4 metric tons. But in the collective memory of the inhabitants of that little island, that's a Pacific island, people remember whose stone it is. And if you buy a new house and you say, let me pay with this stone, then there is a record, a ledger, but it's an oral ledger that, well, the stone went to this person who sold you the house. The Swiss franc, which looks cute, right? We actually don't know if it's a true Swiss franc. We don't know if it's really the value it pretends to be, and so on. And so the notion of trust is very, very deeply involved with social phenomena, with how people interact with others. And we need to study how this can be changed in the digital age. So the definition of trust, is the willingness of a given party to rely on the actions or judgment of another party. And digital trust is very simply that we would like to feel the same trust in the digital world that we are used to in the real world. Now, in the real world, we have a gazillion things and processes and people who take care of this, okay? And in some sense, we have to transform this in an efficient way into the digital world. This is a global approach. Technology is just a small part of it. I really want to say this as a leader of an institute of technology. We are tool builders. We don't solve the problems. We don't govern. We are not into governance. We are not into policy. We can throw these tools to society. Society has to discuss it, has to decide what is the right usage of the tools. And remember, a tool can be used for good. Fire was invented to do great cooking. It can also be used, in wars. So the digital tools are exactly of the same sort. And it's very important that all stakeholders sit around the table, inform each other, discuss, and find good solutions. Let me move to data. So data is this magic thing where there is always a balance between privacy and usage of the results. If I take an example, I'll come back to this, which is medical data. was mentioned at the beginning. Medical data is something that, of course, is highly private, that can be misused by for-profit corporation, but it's also super important if you're trying to find a cure, let's say for COVID, or a cure for cancer. And this balancing act is something we can explore using state-of-the-art technology. Security, everybody knows about this, not only from a cybersecurity point of view, but also from a legal point of view. Discrimination is maybe somewhat more recent topic, but certainly very visible in everything related to artificial intelligence. You know, you put in data and the machine learns the biases that is already present in the data. And this, of course, is super central if these algorithms are actually used to do credit ratings or, you know, job application ratings, to take just two examples. Now, if data is the new oil, well, you know, oil needs to be refined. And we would like to see how these oil refineries are actually clean, ethical, and sustainable. Now, the current refineries are the GAFAMs, and they do a fine job, right? I use some of their tools daily, but we are not quite sure, coming back to the Chapat cartoon on Facebook, that it's really clean, ethical, and sustainable. So could we make the usage of data as well clean, ethical, and sustainable? And these are really the challenges that we as a society have to address, not industry alone in a corner, not some monopolistic data gatherers. It is really society, including politics, but also civil society, NGOs, and of course industry and the economies that has to find the right solutions. And this needs a digital data governance, which is something many people talk about, but it is not easy, especially in a fractured world that we live in. Currently, it is very hard to find digital governance, also because the understanding of basic notions how societies should function have different interpretations in different parts of the world. And this, of course, has an immediate impact on digital governance. But Geneva, by the way, is, of course, a fantastic place to talk about this. Geneva has a role in governance, has always had, with the presence of many, many international organizations and a top-notch institute like the Graduate Institute. Let me just talk about a few examples to make this more concrete. The Swiss COVID app, I hope you use it. It's interesting because it's a stress test on the healthcare system in Switzerland. The app itself is a marvelous construction by colleagues at EPFL and at ETH. It is, I think, best in class. It's not perfect. You can always find, you can always shoot holes in these things, but it's probably the best solution that is available. Yet it is not well inscribed in the health service in Switzerland. I don't want to elaborate on this. My colleague Ed Bugnon might talk about this. He knows all about this. But it is one of the tools. It is not the tool. It's one of the tools that is necessary to master the second wave or subsequent waves of the current pandemic. It's also an example of distributed healthcare systems where the data stays on the mobile phones of the users. It's not gathered in a central place. It is protected. It is only shared with the users being aware and okay with it. Medco is a very nice project that my colleague Jean-Pierre Rubaud is very involved in. It is exactly the sharing of medical data for the greater good, but while using very sophisticated techniques, both from a cryptographic point of view and from a machine learning point of view, so the data is safely stored in the places where it is actually gathered, in the university hospitals, in this case, ultimately, potentially on the mobile phones of the individual users. This allows actually to develop state-of-the-art machine learning for finding, for example, the effects of certain cures in the context of oncology without violating privacy of the patients. All right, let me conclude and first say that, of course, we love the collaboration we have in the Arc Lémanique. certainly the one with the Graduate Institute, as we discussed with Marie-Laure, a lot of potential. With the two neighboring universities in Geneva, in Lausanne, and of course IMD, with an institute that we have also a lot of joint program with. I think the ecosystem in the Lake Geneva region is absolutely fantastic. I think it's unique. And with this, let me also mention an associated institute, which is the Cyber Peace Institute, created last September on the initiative of Brad Smith from Microsoft. And with all this, let me conclude and simply say, as the world goes digital, we need to solve these problems of trust, of fairness, of privacy, of democratic control. We need to ask whose data it is. If it is the value, it is obviously something that belongs to the citizens first, and they should decide where it goes. And as a researcher, I find data the ultimate interdisciplinary topic. It's of course in the middle of social science and humanities. We as technologists can provide tools, but it is society that has to keep the lead. And I have to conclude with the usual New Yorker cartoon. You probably have seen that one. The official says, if anyone here suspects that the algorithm that puts these two together might be flawed, speak now. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Martin, for those raising these interesting questions, which we're going to be discussing for the rest of the day and certainly the rest of the year and next year as well, but it'll be a good start for us today. And thank you, Marie-Laure and Richard, also for helping to set the stage for the day. Just wanted to raise a few quick points before we move over to the first panel. First, if you happen to tweet about today, please use the hashtag data2025, and we hope you do. We're dividing up the day in a few different parts. In the morning, we're going to have two sessions, one on what is data and why is that an important question, and then we're going to use some, and then in the second session, after the coffee break, we'll be talking specifically about the questions with the COVID app that Martin raised and other questions about healthcare and pandemics. Then in the afternoon, we'll have two sessions, one on the principles of data governance from a multi-stakeholder perspective, how to start to govern all this data. And then the final session in the afternoon, what is the future practice of data governance? And then Richard Baldwin will moderate a final high-level panel discussing a bunch of broad key issues about today and the future. I saw a few questions in the chat. A recording will be available on our website at the end of the day if you're not able to stay for all of the sessions. Also, for reasons that are only known to Zoom, we're just going to ask everyone to log off quickly during the coffee breaks and the lunch, and then log back on so we can start a new session. Finally, we'd just like to thank Geneva Solutions for covering our conference last week in their technology newsletter. Would like to note that we're holding this conference in the context of the Road to Bern, where the World Data Forum will be held next year. And would also like to thank the Geneva Internet Platform for their support of the day. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce the head of the Geneva Internet Platform, Jovan Kurbalija, who will moderate the first panel on what is data. Jovan?
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. It's really great honor to join today's conference and to follow for excellent setting of the stage for our discussion. As you can see, I'm based just next door to the Graduate Institute, and I lead the Geneva Internet Platform, which is basically the place where technology meets diplomacy. And in particular, we have been running a Road to Bern via Geneva, series of events through which we try to connect the dots among different silos by putting people from security field to people involved in humanitarian, e-commerce and other areas. Now, we have an excellent lineup for today's discussion. We have with us Kenneth Cukier, the senior editor from The Economist, Dr. Katharina Höne, Director of Research at DiploFoundation, and Robert West, professor from the EPFL in charge of data development. You can find a lot of data and a lot of information about them and their work. Now, without further ado, I would like to dive deep into our discussion today and show a few illustrations of both use of data and importance of data. Diplo's data lab processed 1 million words generated during the last week Internet Governance Forum. And as you can see, data is in the center of discussion. It was the most frequently used word in this word cloud. And what we also noticed is interesting development of use of the data in the context of sovereignty. There is a shift from 2019 from the digital sovereignty, cyber e-sovereignty towards data sovereignty. Therefore, it is the right time to discuss data, and it is the right time to also see what is realistic and what is the real issue when it comes to data. We heard in the introductory statement that there is a magic around data, and this is both good because the technology should be a bit utopian. It should inspire discussion, but there is also a risk of misconception and misunderstandings. And this is exactly the reason why we start our discussion today with a session on what is data. And this is the question that I would like to pose to our panelists. We will start with Kenneth Cukier, and then the other panelists will answer the same question. In the meantime, I would like to invite you to pose your questions, comments in chat or a Q&A, and those questions we will try to answer. There is already traditionally the first question from Richard Hill asking, what is data monetarization of our session today? Maybe in chat, you will try to start answering this question, and we will also ask our panelists later on to focus on that question. Ken, what is data?
Oh, that is such a good question. And the answer is, as someone who's been thinking about it for a very long time, I can't say I don't know, although that's sort of like a natural sort of academic foil that when you pose the question that you don't know. But it's to say that I've been thinking long and hard about it. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that most people really haven't thought about it. And so I think that although you could have a conference and a book just on this, we don't have time for that. There's a lot of bigger issues at stake. So we should actually romp through this first section to talk about what is data and actually clarify it in our minds in a very substantial way so that you can build, we as a community can build on it afterwards. So let me take it from the most very basic level, if you will. Allow me to say, there is something about data, and to ask our question, what is data? We need to ask ourselves, perhaps, what is empirical evidence? And if we ask ourselves, what is empirical evidence? We would ask ourselves, well, what is information? And if we ask ourselves, what is information? We would ask ourselves, what is reality? And if we ask ourselves, what is reality? We would ask ourselves, what is consciousness? But wait, hold on a second. No. We're not going to go all the way there. That would be crazy. That's a PhD dissertation. That's a different forum. Let's not go there. It's not consciousness. Let's build ourselves back up. So there's something called consciousness, fine, whatever. There's something called reality. We all sort of have one, right? And sometimes it's the same, sometimes it's not. And there's something called information. And information is sort of everywhere. In fact, it might be the fabric of the universe if you speak to certain physicists. And then there's something called empirical evidence, and then there's something called data. And why I bring this up as a liaison is that there are things in the world that are informational. Where am I? I am in Southwest London right now. I'm in a particular place, but it's not data. We needed to datafy it. We needed to render it into data. What is data? Well, data would be an alphanumeric, symbolic way. Sorry, I've got children leaving the household this morning. We've got it's a symbolic way to interpret this information quality that's around us. So how would we datafy it? Well, we could use something like GPS, and I could say that's where I am. Or we could say it's Cartesian coordinates. that's where I am. There's even a service called 3 Words that identifies every place on Earth by 3 different words. That would be a lot easier to say and quicker for first responders than to use Cartesian coordinates, which people don't use much anymore, or using GPS, which people do use all the time, but has a weird numerical string. Now, why we say this is that the data has an information quotient. It represents some informational quality. The data represents an informational quality that tries to describe the world, tries to describe reality. And sometimes that fits very, very well if we think the GPS identifies where we are, and sometimes it doesn't. So for example, we know that the data is not always representative of the information in the same way that a map is not always representative of territory when we think of something like VAR, the value at risk metric that was used by the large Wall Street banks prior to the financial crisis in 2007, in which they tried to identify every evening at around 5 o'clock their risk, value at risk. And it was a metric that was used to understand risk in the financial markets and their own liabilities. Now, of course, it had been divorced from the informational content that it was trying to depict, but that was the data that they used. So we've got data and we've got information, right? William Petty created statistics, and when he wanted to identify the population of London versus the population of Dublin versus the population of Edinburgh, he used chimneys because they didn't have a census at the time, right? And chimneys was his proxy for population. So the point here is that the humans have translated and interpreted the data, and they do it in 2 ways. One, in the creation of it, what is it I'm trying to depict? And secondly, in how I interact with it and what it says. So we could say that inside there might be bias in the data, that it actually has, there's say racist data because we're racist in society, it's racist, but it's actually in the creation, the foundational aspect of it, and then in the interpretation at the end of it. We've created it as well as how we've used it, right? Or what it actually represents, separate from what we've wanted it to be. So we know that, for example, we're not always very good at identifying this. We in the West, we have a concept of snow, and that the data might be what we've called it, whereas Eskimos have 50 different, the Inuits in Canada, this is true, I looked it up, have about over 50 different words to depict snow. They've got a much more granularity, a granular sense of this. So why do I say all of this? Why, this seems like it's like you've invited a journalist to start doing philosophy about data, because machine learning takes this idea, or I should actually say, I could call it machine learning, but I'll just say the modern ways in which technology allows us to interact with data and information. We could call it machine learning, deep learning, but that's not the point. The point is that we have these new tools to interact with data. But if we don't understand what it is and its limitations, we come up with the wrong answers. So why this is so critical is because machine learning works best. The algorithms work best when it has all the raw data. And now everyone who has heard me say this, who knows anything about data, has automatically dug in their heels, raised their red flags and said, whoa, hold a second. All the raw data, that's crazy. You can never have all the data, that's a fiction, it doesn't ever happen. And data is never raw. You've just told us yourself that in fact it always has to be this sort of, it's a symbolic translation, an interpretation of a person. So it can't actually be raw. It's not actually depicting the real thing. It's always the map, it's never the territory. That's true. But so if we don't say all the raw data, what we really, although that's the archetype, what we really mean is high dimensional unstructured data. And that's a term that's used in the academic papers. So what do people mean by high dimensional unstructured data? And why does that matter that I've been harking on this for so long and started with the idea of consciousness? Okay, let's try to understand what this means. High dimensional means that it has many different dimensions. We think in 3 dimensions, time, space, etc. But a dimension can be a quality or variable. And if it's high dimensional, it might not have, say, just if we're looking at a cell, it might not just be the color that it is, or it might not be the thickness of the wall, or it might not be the gradation in a piece of cellular material. Those would all be dimensions. But let's say there's actually not 8 dimensions, but 800. Let's say 8,000. Let's say there's 8 million, of which human beings are really only aware of 80, right? But there's 3 orders of magnitude more. There's 8 million dimensions that are possible to understand about a cell. but we only have a limited account because our eyes don't have, our retinas are not very good, and maybe some other organism would be better, but the machines would be better. That's high dimensional. And then what do we mean by unstructured? Well, it means it's not been curated. The human being hasn't interpreted into it, or it has to a minimal degree. So if we take visual information, say a picture of a cell, we might have an algorithm pick out and identify aspects and traits of it that we don't even have a concept of, and therefore don't have a word for, so therefore couldn't label, but would still be a feature. And the point about these techniques that we're using, machine learning, why it's so different than customary statistics, is that we're constantly learning how much we don't know. We call it a black box. That just simply is a descriptor we use to say that actually we couldn't understand how it came to its conclusion. That's true. But the point is that when you look at some of the most interesting research, the ones, for example, and I can get you the details later, of retinas, and looking at retinas that could identify with about 93%, 97% accuracy, whether the retina is from a male or a female. Why that was so shocking and interesting was ophthalmologists and scientists never even knew that the retina had that quality that was encoding for gender, yet it was, right? So what is it that it's seeing? What is it finding? We don't know. But if you take that same approach as a template, that's why we're able to take a lot of this technique and apply it to other areas, like we have with the Daphne Kohler study from 2012 from Harvard and Greg Beck, who was able to identify with a machine learning algorithm cases of cancer in biopsies far better than human pathologists, but identifying 11 telltale traits that best predict cancer when the medical literature only knew of 8 of them. 3 of the things where practitioners didn't know to look for, but the algorithm was able to identify. So the importance here is that we needed to have, quote unquote, all the raw data or high dimensional unstructured data. Now let's look at the policies that we use to actually govern data, and we find out there's a mismatch. The whole foundation of privacy policy presumes that you know that you needed the smallest amount of data and you know what you're going to do with it at the outset. Although that seems logical if you're in the 19th century and you're Galton, right? It doesn't sound logical if you're in the 21st century and you're a machine learning algorithmist, right? So this is where I end up, that we now, as we've sort of traveled this sort of spectrum of what data is and what it represents, there is a new quality to it because of our new tools that we couldn't interact with it before and tap before. And now we can unearth the informational quotient of that data in a way that we couldn't before, because we're making inferences, right? Before, we were using the data for what it was able to represent in a concrete, cognitively understood way. William Petty is looking at chimneys, and chimneys represent population, okay? But that's not the world we're in today, and we need to rethink our governance and our policies if we're going to get the maximum value out of our data.
Thank you, Ken, for this lovely journey. And you put a few important signposts. One is nothing is new under the sun. We have been collecting data, reflecting reality through the data information, and it's important distinction. And the second point is everything is new under the sun. There is no sun today in Geneva. It's quite cloudy, I guess, like in London. And I think that dynamics is extremely important. You mentioned philosophy as important aspect. And I just got a hint email from my colleague in the Diplo's AI lab. They may generate your speech on any other issue based on your statement today, or all of our speakers who spoke during the introductory session. Bringing back to this question of inference and managing unstructured data. Lovely introduction. We move to Kat. The same question, what is data? Kat has a background in international relations, philosophy, theater study, and science fiction. She's running now the project on science fiction and digital policy. The book will be ready soon. Kat, what is your take on what is data and this introduction from Ken? Go ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Jovan. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and obviously it's a hard task to follow this kind of introduction. However, what I noticed, there are some interesting overlaps between what we heard from Ken and some of the things I wanted to say. So I think there's also already some great synergy within this panel. So the question, what is data? And I want to break it down into several sub-questions. Being an academic, that's what academics do. So I want to kind of hint at, what is it for? What is big data? How can we make sense of it? And then also a kind of important question, what is it not? So let me start with the question of what is it for? And here I can see the overlap with what Ken said, because I think ultimately it's to create an understanding of the world for us. And this, I think, presupposes an idea of what the world is and how we can access it, how we can create knowledge about it. And what I think is important to stress here is that to some extent, the answer to these two questions kind of depend on the context and on where you are in the world sometimes. And the answer to these questions, I think, certainly depends on what you're actually interested in knowing. So as Jovan mentioned, I have a background in international relations, and that's exactly where I want to hook into in this case. And particularly the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, so the kind of international agenda around development. So as we moved from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals, we started to see a huge emphasis on data. So there were slogans like, measure what we treasure, what gets measured gets done. And let me be clear, I think this is a good thing. What we ended up with the SDGs are 231 unique indicators that kind of come from a long consultation process where different stakeholders agreed that these are the best indicators. The problem we have now, we kind of have this framework, but we also have a data gap. Some countries are missing the capacities to provide the data, and in particular, statistical capacities. So obviously capacity building is needed, and the resources are needed to even in the first place kind of provide this data. And what I would mention here is that in some cases, indeed, big data can come to the rescue as a proxy in cases where traditional statistical results are simply not there. And this also kind of hooks nicely into what Ken said, because one example in cases where traditional household survey data is not available is to use satellite images and the analysis of satellite images by looking at houses and to kind of use the material of the roof of the house as a proxy for the economic status of the people living in the house. So this really reminds me of the example with the chimneys and a 21st century equivalent, basically. So I already mentioned big data, but I think before we get into big data, I want to get back to the old kind of data for just a second. And one key distinction there is the distinction between qualitative and quantitative data. And when we look at the SDG agenda, there is an emphasis on quantitative data for good reason. But I want to kind of put a question mark here just a little bit, mainly by having this focus and this emphasis, are we actually gaining the best possible understanding of the world for what we're trying to achieve in this context? Are we generating the knowledge that we should be generating? I'm not the one to answer this, but I think it's, again, worth asking this question. But I already mentioned big data, so let me kind of dive into this. And definitions are always a bit problematic, but I want to offer one definition that kind of puts the human at the center of big data. So we can actually look at big data in relation to human activity. And for me personally, for my research interest, this is a very valuable perspective. So when we follow this perspective, we can say that big data is generated what people say, and it is generated by what people do. So what people say includes online news, social media, radio, and TV. And what people do? Well, traffic movements, mobile communication, financial transaction, postal traffic, utility consumption, and emissions of various kinds. So we kind of, through this lens, get a sense that we get a lot more information about humans, what they say, what they do, and we get a lot more ways of analyzing this. And this can be a really interesting thing and a thing for good, so to speak. And as Ken alluded to, of course, also a dangerous thing. Speaking of that, my third question was, how can we make sense of it all? And Jovan mentioned that I'm also interested in science fiction and literature. So one way of making sense of things from that perspective is through metaphors. I want to offer 3 metaphors. First metaphor, data is the new oil. Second, data is nuclear energy. And third, data is, or big data more specifically, I should have said. So big data is nuclear energy. And third, big data is teenage sex. Let me explain. Data is the new oil is a metaphor we're very familiar with. And the idea here is that it creates new value. It's a raw material for other industries, and it offers a competitive advantage for industries and countries. When we take another perspective and we say data is like nuclear energy, and in particular personal data, personal big data, we kind of start to focus on the dangerous and harmful aspects and the need for strong regulation, basically. And we also start to think that perhaps there are long-term effects, and perhaps there's something that generates energy, but that can also be weaponized, and therefore it is also somehow dangerous. And then the last metaphor I mentioned, big data as teenage sex. So here the idea is almost every teenager is talking about it, but very few of them are actually doing it. So this is also a question to kind of get us a bit at questioning some of the hype, perhaps, when we talk about big data. So my last point, what is it not? And I think this is an important question to ask also. And here my point is basically, data and big data are not decisions. They do not equal decision-making. They do not translate into political decisions. They do not directly translate into personal decisions. I think climate change is a good example. We have a lot of knowledge about climate change, a lot of data that translated into knowledge. The science, so to speak, is clear, yet personal opinions differ. And political decision-making is also somehow, in my opinion, lagging behind the kind of available information we already have. Perhaps again, to bring this back to the area of diplomacy and international relations, which is my field, a good example perhaps comes from conflict resolution. So if you imagine a border conflict, we can easily monitor that conflict through satellite imagery. We can automate this process of looking at satellite images and analyzing what are the movements at this border, what are the movements of troops, what are the movements of perhaps machinery or weaponry. So in essence, we have a very good basis, a very good analysis that could help monitor this conflict and contribute to a peaceful conflict resolution. But this does not neatly translate into an agreement by both parties that are involved in this conflict, or an agreement, a trust in this analysis, or basically an acceptance of this tool. So a lot more things have to be done to translate the information we have or the knowledge we have into decision-making, which also I think nicely relates to what we heard at the very beginning, this question about trust, which I think is also something that is gonna come up in our discussion during the whole day. So let me stop here and hand over to Jovan, and thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to the discussion and your questions.
Thank you, Kat. I can see that you will energize our Twitter discussion with the 3 metaphors, in particular with the third one. And you brought the question of literature, science fiction, and one information what Kat is doing now with the theater team within Diplo. She's preparing the course on AI and data as a theater play, as on some sort of storytelling. Therefore, this is this attempt to anchor the latest into the old and traditional ways of communication. Before we move to Bob to reflect on the technical and machine learning aspect, one point from your discussion is very important. We know very little about data. There was a question by Richard Hill at the beginning. What is the monetarization of our session today? What is the level of data traffic between Switzerland and the rest of the world? Only 38% of the data on climate change and the weather, therefore scientific data, is available currently according to Sustainable Development Goals. Therefore, while we are discussing the data and the big issue, to paraphrase the old John Lennon saying, the life is happening in positive or negative ways. Therefore, that is very important. It's reflected in questions that we are receiving to have that reality check on economy, on side effects, on collaterals. Now, Bob, bring us the tech enlightenment to our discussion. Go ahead. Robert West from EPFL, go ahead.
Hello, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So it seems as the tech guy, I'm the only one who prepared slides. I feel like I have to apologize for that. But anyways, it's useful because also I can show you the answer to your question, Jovan. What is data? It's on line 4 of the t-shirt that we have in the lab. Everything is data. So I made this t-shirt for the lab when I had just started and I still had time for things like that. Now I wouldn't anymore, but here's some value I derived from the t-shirt. Okay, so here you go. So I direct the EPFL Data Science Lab, and this is our website, and I'm showing this because also I want to give credit to the people in my lab. But this is what we look like now in online mode. This is what I look like when I wear pants. But the point I'm showing you this this website is because there's some interesting point here that on which I would like to latch. To make that point, I want to point out a similarity that I have with this guy here, Dr. Faustus. It's not the doctoral degree. It's not the fact that we're both Germans. It's also not the fact that we both like to talk to the devil that we have in common. Rather, the common thing that we have is this statement. Zwei Seelen wohnen ach in meiner Brust. Two souls live ach in my chest. And the two souls are not our online and our offline soul, which are visualized on this slide. It's rather implicit in this list of things that we do in my lab. I'm zooming in here. Two things we do is machine learning and computational social science. And those are actually quite different. So to explain why I say these correspond to two souls that are living in my chest, let me start a new slide because this one is getting a bit crowded. So two modes of using data fundamentally are what I'm trying to visualize on this slide. You can use data to make predictions, to forecast, to maximize your predictive accuracy, basically. Predict the weather or predict the stock market. You know, if you want to predict the stock market, you don't care much why you're making that money, as long as you're making that money. Okay, a very different kind of using data is to use it for understanding. If you want to explain why something happens, if you want to understand the mechanisms that lead from a cause to an effect, and that's a very, currently, you use very different techniques for doing prediction versus understanding. Machine learning, currently, it's changing, but currently machine learning mostly cares about making predictions. It doesn't care so much about understanding where these predictions come from. Computational social science, on the other hand, cares mostly about understanding, eliciting cause and effect, rather than about making super accurate predictions only. I strongly believe that this Faustian quadrant up here is really where we should be. And of course, there's a trade-off between predicting and understanding. There's also theoretical results about it that there's no free lunch, basically, but the field has seen progress towards the Faustian quadrant recently. And this is because of work such as that by people like Judah Pearl, who originally came from machine learning, but then strongly started believing that the way we do things there is not enough. And then he became more of an advocate of causality over the course of decades. He won Turing Award also for this. By the way, great book that I can highly recommend, The Book of Why, is basically an understandable version of Pearl's usually very convoluted writings. So this one is actually illuminating even for non-technical people. Okay, so in the remainder of my few minutes, I would like to present some of the dangers that we might incur if we do not move into this northeast Faustian quadrant here. I said that machine learning usually cares about predicting. So for example, in a medical context, we might ask a machine, will person X die in the next 30 days? That's a useful thing to know, but isn't it even more useful to know why will X die in the next 30 days? Because if we know the reason, then we can thwart the reason. If we understand, we can act. Another danger of purely maximizing the accuracy of predictions is that if we do that, then we become vulnerable to biases in the data. There's this famous example of Google's image labeling algorithm, labeling African Americans as gorillas. This caused a huge public debate. And this was because this was a best effort, obviously, by Google, right? They trained on all the raw data that they could get to cite the words of Ken. In this case, it did not pay off for machine learning to use all the raw data that was there, because all the raw data that was there for training contained mostly white people and animals, more so than a diverse mix of humans. So the data just picked up on these signals, and since there were more gorillas in the training data than black people, it was more likely to the algorithm to make it seem more beneficial to make that prediction. Okay, so it's of course tempting to fix the problem the way Google did. They simply made the algorithm never ever predict gorilla anymore. But that's of course not real progress. This is just a cheap fix. Another problem, if we just maximize accuracy rather than add understanding to our algorithms, is that we make ourselves very vulnerable to adversaries. For example, what I show here is the output that a state-of-the-art image recognition system gives for this picture of a banana. You see that it predicts 99.something% banana and a little bit of slug. Now, if an adversary comes along and adds some sort of, it's like a sticker, a patch to this image, which you can actually print on your computer and put into the real world to fool recognition systems, then you can print a sticker that makes everything be recognized as a toaster. So this is the toaster sticker, right? And this is because there's no true understanding in this image recognition system. If there was true understanding, then the algorithm could reason, if it's yellow and it's bent and it lies on a table surface, then it's likely to be a banana, even if there's a weird tie-dye patch next to it. Currently, the systems don't do that. And finally, I want to give a bit of a different perspective. Imagine you give the logs of everything that you do on your smartphone away to someone to use it for artificial intelligence. If that party is benevolent, then they can do amazing things for you with this data. They can personalize your search results, they can remind you of your important dates, they can optimize your nutrition, and so on. But if they're malevolent, oh boy, I guess I don't think I need to go into the details there. The more dangerous, this is even more dangerous, the better the adversary understands you. Think of malicious marketing, such as Cambridge Analytica. If the adversary truly understands you, then they can wreak even more havoc. So the point I want to make here is this. In some cases, it's beneficial if the entity who makes predictions based on your data does not understand your data, but can still make good predictions. In my lab, we've pursued a paradigm that we call learning without knowing, where the data remains on client devices and is shared in cleverly chunked up in an anonymized form in order to reveal just the bits that are necessary to make good predictions without allowing the machine learner, who could be malicious, to learn anything about you personally. So this is another example where machine learning is not best off for society if it uses all the raw data, but just those bits that are truly useful for the situation where you want to have utility. So let me conclude with this slide where I ask a question that was circled around by Jovan in preparation of the panel. Is more data always better? And my answer here is no. Big data is not necessarily great data. If you have more data, you can reduce variance if you add more and more, but you cannot fundamentally reduce a bias. This is not a very insightful statement that I just made. It's actually just a definition. Bias is exactly that part of the data that you cannot remove by just grabbing more data. And if there is bias, you will never get rid of it by just adding more of the same. In maybe a more catchy phrase, tera garbage is worse than kilo garbage. You know, it's still garbage, but it takes more storage, it takes more compute costs in the cloud. So you should basically keep as little of it as possible in order to make get the utility that you want. And yeah, so one distinction, one point of pride that we have in our lab is that we can easily process terabytes without a pearl of sweat. But some of the most powerful studies we have done in the lab have been based on small data that was carefully and cleverly collected. So I think an important distinction to make here is broad data versus deep data. Broad data is just, you know, collecting as much as you can. That doesn't necessarily help you further. Deep data, I would say, is data that allows you to derive understanding of the world, and therefore will have higher utility in general. Okay, so with that, I hand it back to Jovan for the discussion looking forward.
Lovely, Bob. I was waiting for Mephisto to jump out of the screen somewhere, and it was moving around, but you carefully hided him and gave us some hope with all necessary with all necessary caveats which come with the danger of data. And you gave a nice intro to one of the questions about the nature of, in particular, big data and relevance. And my favorite question, which I ask my students, and that's probably the most difficult question, how small can be big data? And it sounds as a very trivial question, but under that you have philosophical, mathematical, and other issues. Lovely intro, link to philosophy, link to the great literature. I expected a bit of Wittgenstein in the intro, but we can get back to it. Now, before I pass the floor to Ken, Kat, and Bob again, here is the summary what has been going in our chat discussion. There was one line of comments which related to economic aspects and what is trade-off. In particular, question by Simran Sinha, question of negative side effects and externalities. What do we get from data and what do we lose? It was pointed to Kenneth, but other panelists can answer. Then they were a bit of cautious about metaphors, and by Pedristrad, by Pilar, and they say be cautious with oil, blood, and other metaphors. And that could be interesting to hear from the panelists about that, because there is a justified reason that metaphors sometimes can misguide the discussion. And then there was a whole discussion about big data, and including the question, does it mean that if China, for example, has the biggest source of data, does it mean that it automatically transforms in the power of China, and let's say on the other side, Singapore or Malta or Switzerland, small countries without a lot of data? That's an interesting question, which I think we should unpack. Now, and there was a very good comment from Yves Shemail. I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name. Understanding difference between explanation, social sciences, and the causation, which is in traditional sciences, explaining Bob's diagram between explaining and predicting. Great. Back to Ken. Ken, quite a few. You really provoked interesting discussion. I think this is the function of The Economist as a journal, and I would say Economist as a scientist and academics. Over to you.
Great. Yeah. No. Thank you very much. So I thought both my fellow panelists' points were very, very interesting. And I want to just go, there's a lot to talk about, but let me just maybe start it off with just one element, one point to how Robert ended his remarks. This idea of broad versus deep, or big data and bias. I don't disagree with what he said if you qualify it, but I think it can be, I think that he used a shorthand that if we didn't use, we'd come to it, we'd describe it differently. If the data is biased, then having more of the same data is going to simply perpetuate that bias. if the data is biased, and if some of the data is biased, but not all of the data is biased, then by adding more data, we minimize the amount of bias that's in the data, and we in effect overcome it. So let's take the example that he used of the algorithm that Google was looking at in terms of the image recognition system that looked at Black people and described them as gorillas. The problem, if you will, wasn't that the data was biased, right? It was that the data set was underrepresentative of some quality, in this case, Black people, okay? So it came to the wrong conclusion. Now, the answer there isn't to say it's biased and throw up your hands. It's not biased, right? It's underrepresented. I mean, there, if you will, there, the bias is in the underrepresentativeness, not in the informational quotient of the data itself. And therefore, the solution is that you actually increase by many orders of magnitude the number of Black faces that you put into the data set, and then in theory it should work. In the same way that when you have a white person, it doesn't show a snow bear from Canada, right? It says, it presumes that it's a white person. So because there's just enough of these examples that it can make an accurate prediction, it would do the exact same thing with Black people. So if the data is, if we treat that as acceptable, then suddenly you can see that there is actually inherently a purpose of big data. If you have a broadly distributed amount of information in each data set, for example, if I take a population of a canton in Switzerland and try to understand, well, what predicts cancer, what predicts a genetic mutation is a better example. Well, the fact is you're going to get a diversity of people and you'll get one answer. If I take the entire population of all of Switzerland, right, which is probably going to be about 15 times larger, I'll be able to identify small subcategories that the initial data set wouldn't have presented, because there wouldn't have been enough of those examples that it would have looked like an outlier, not like a rare case. So I would simply point out the fact that although I agreed with what he said, there was a qualification to it. I'll bring it back to you guys to take out.
No, okay. Think about the second question that was raised, and let's be very practical. What is a trade-off? Zoom will gather some data from our discussion today, and it will monetize. Are we happy with it? We have excellent transmission. This is a cool session. We have a chat. There is 100 people sharing their thoughts around the issue. And that was one of the questions in the discussion. What are externalities and how we can make a reasonable trade-off in this Faustian bargain that we have been having with the data? That's just for later on. Kat, over to you. How small can be a big data?
I don't know. I would like to hear Rob on this actually, but I can tell you why this is an important question for me. I mean, when we look at international relations, we hear this argument quite a bit that the US and China have an advantage because they have access to much more data compared to smaller countries. And I'm not sure how much this argument holds. And there are good reasons for example, data sharing agreements between different countries. We see this in the European Union, kind of creating a common market where data is shared, where then developments in machine learning and AI are also done in collaboration. So we have that. On the other hand, if you look at, for example, national artificial intelligence strategies, some of the smaller countries explicitly mention, well, of course, we don't have big data, but we have quality data. So we can offer something that perhaps the bigger countries can't by having what they call quality data. What that exactly means, I'm not sure, but it kind of reminds me of what Rob said towards the end of his presentation. So I think there's something to unpack here that I would be very interested to hear more about. Last point, perhaps, one difference that we perhaps should also bring into the discussion is the distinction between causation and correlation. So from where I'm standing there's an argument that machine learning and the insights created there are correlation, but then it needs human insight to basically determine, is there a causal relationship here, or is there just some kind of other connection? Is there actually a causal effect that then can help us intervene by making the right kind of decisions. Again, thinking of political decision making here. And again, this reminds me of what Rob kind of alluded to in one of his slides. So again, I would like to hear from him. What is this difference, and can actually machine learning get us to causation? Can it explain causal effects? What is, from the perspective of someone who's actually doing it, how do you approach that distinction? So that's it from me for now.
Thank you, Kat. You didn't answer the question how small can be big data, but you gave us a nice, really nice intro for unpacking this really mechanic element: more data, more power. That has to be revisited. Although we can see that countries like Switzerland, Singapore, small countries, which would be on losing side in the case of data sovereignty, which is another important aspect, they're more proactive in negotiation for multilateral arrangement on digital and data issues. This is an interesting, let's say, correlation or causation. We can discuss it in more details. Bob, your time to answer all of these questions from panelists. Go ahead.
Yeah, so big data is of course just a buzzword. You know, whenever I use the word, I just use it for bragging to people who know nothing about what I'm doing. Really, it's of course there's no inherently size that you need in order to be useful, right? If I want to answer the question, what will happen if I press the W key on my keyboard? You know, which letter will appear on my screen? I don't need big data for that, right? Like I need one data point, and that's enough. So it always depends on what you want to do. My PhD personally was, although it was in data mining and so on, I worked with a 1 megabyte file usually. So this is very small data for our standards, but it was extremely high quality data. I could get 150 pages of mileage out of that. And this is really kind of the question that we should ask. How useful is the data? How big does the data have to be in order to solve the task that I want to solve? And there's no unique answer to that. And coming back to Ken's point about bias, when solving that imbalance issue that you're mentioning, you are by definition removing the bias. So we are talking about the same thing. I guess I was using a technical definition of bias, which is in the limit of infinite data. You know, how far off will you be? Will you be the true answer, basically? And so if you find a way of balancing the data set, adding a bit more here, adding a bit more there, then you are precisely solving the problem of bias, and we wouldn't have it anymore. But that's also exactly where the difficulty is. How do you know for a general set of downstream tasks, which corners of the data do you need more of, and how do you have to balance all these different distinctions? It's a priori not even clear that color of skin is a useful characteristic of the data points. So it's highly non-trivial to do any sort of balancing. First, because even if you had the types of classes, then you wouldn't know what their proportion should be. And second, we don't even have the types of the classes within the data usually. And then there was this question of causation versus correlation, and the bias question is deeply connected to that, because biases are exactly what screws over basically the current machine learning algorithms when it comes to correlation versus causation, because we have biases correspond to confounds. They are the things when you have a treatment and you have an effect, and the confounds are those things that are correlated both with the treatment and with the effect, and so they bias your estimation of the causal effect. So moving forward towards artificial intelligence that can tease apart correlation from causation is deeply connected to bias removal. Currently, you're right that most machine learning algorithms are focusing on modeling correlations. It's much harder to model causation because machine learning is built on statistics, and causation is traditionally outside of the realm of statistics. This has interesting historical roots, because basically the field of modern statistics, when it was invented in the late 19th and early 20th century by people like Galton and Pearson and Fisher and so on. These people were, from all I can tell by reading a bit on the history of science there, these were not agreeable people. These were people that really thought that they owned the field because they thought they invented it. And Pearson, sorry, this is Fisher, never admitted to the fact that we can even reason about causation, probably because he just couldn't wrap his own mind around it. And then he didn't, because he had such high self-esteem, he didn't think that anyone else could do. And that's why it took over 100 years for us to finally attack this issue again in machine learning, kind of throwing away the shackles that the old statistician had put on us. And that's why Pearl also talks of the causal revolution, because within this field, it is truly a revolution to talk about causation as a real thing. For many decades, when you submitted to statistical journals and you talked about causation, this was like a blemish. You know, you had to be ashamed basically for even mentioning that word that is unspeakable for statisticians. So and since machine learning is rooted so deeply in statistics, it's really been holding back the field of machine learning also in terms of talking about causation. But we are seeing a big change now, actually, where we have techniques that start to. Scientists have been caring about this all the time, obviously, right? The science is exactly the point of science is exactly to tell causation from correlation, at least for large chunks of natural science, like physics, for example. But now these abilities are coming to artificial intelligence also, which it's not a small task to ask, right? Because it's basically asking to build an automated scientist. This is why this is taking a while, but we are seeing interesting progress, and it has to do a lot with how we model the data. If we just model it as a simple function input-output without any machinery in between, we won't be able to represent the intricacies of the world, the intricate mechanisms that lead from cause to effect. But we're making progress.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. It reminds me of tension that exists in Road to Bern discussion. Road to Bern is run by World Data Forum, run by Statistical Division of the United Nations. And you have now data scientists. And it's very interesting tension, which I have to admit quite a few interesting points from statistician community saying, okay, don't reinvent the wheel. We were there. But what you point is also this sort of a correction from the data scientists. And that interplay will be very interesting. Let me just show you what Diplo's data lab did while we were discussing. And it is a good example how one can misuse data. By the way, whenever we do the research on data and AI, we are very sort of clear about sources, algorithms, and other elements. Our session today, which was on the approximation of the travel between Bern and Geneva, because we couldn't check all participants where they're coming, would basically save for 50 conference participants 9,000 tons of CO2. And they also calculated the question of how much does it cost our time today. They calculated 50 participants on average salary of 80,000 per participants annually. An amount is approximately 2,800. Now, obviously, if we go into this, we can and start unpacking, we can see quite a few elements. But what is the problem, in particular in media? You can get this information and people take it on the face value, and they started quoting, and it became the new sort of new fact. I gave it on purpose, this what we generated now as we have been discussing to show the risks with data. Now with the last iteration of comments, we go back to Ken. Ken, there were these questions on the economics, on the question of externalities. Also, you mentioned in your concluding remark a bit of governance. Recently, Economist published briefing on digital governance with an interesting, I'm big sort of follower of the Economist on two issues, on the Balkans and on the technology, and you rarely failed over the last 20 years. But I would say this coverage was a bit weaker on the governance, which we can discuss in follow-up. What would be your take on the question on the externalities and governance?
Okay, so those are great essential questions. So in terms of the externalities, I don't fully understand the question that the person in the chat presented, in part because I only glanced at it because I was focusing my attention on the conversation. So let me sort of filibuster on what it is while the person then maybe sharpens the question. Filibuster just means sort of talk generally until, well, filibuster means something else. But if the person who posed the question can sort of focus the question even more tightly, I can probably respond to it. I'm nervous when we talk about an externality, because it sort of presumes, as you said, Jovan, that there's a trade-off. You refer to it as a Faustian bargain. And I don't actually see that. I believe that I don't think data is an unmitigated good, but I don't think it's a coin that has two sides either. Data, again, is empirical evidence about the world, and I firmly believe that humankind should use all of its faculties of reason to understand the world, to make the world better. In fact, I think we have a moral imperative to do that. As a result, if we don't use data, I think it's sort of a heinous crime against the cosmos, insofar as we have this ability to use reason to understand the world and improve the world. And if we're not doing that with data, what are we using? Superstition? So if there were to be, if you will, an externality of using it, it's that this data can be misused. But then again, it's a tool, and if it's a tool, anything can be misused. A hammer can be used to hit someone over the head. The central problem, of course, is privacy, and of course is the immorality of using the data to deny people their liberty, their freedom, and their life. Obviously, the story of the example of the Holocaust and the data that was accessible to the Nazis as they were invading European countries, and those countries that had more complete civil records enabled the Nazis to round up Jews more effectively and therefore kill them than countries that actually had weaker civil or less complete, less detailed civil records, and therefore the Jews could actually escape the Nazis more effectively. This story actually is one that's repeated in Africa, in Rwanda recently, only in our own memory in the last few decades.
And just one I was just reminded, and you will help me not to become persona non grata in Geneva, because time is here of utmost importance. Just maybe to wrap up, to ask quickly Kat and Bob for the last statements, and Ken, thank you for this crucial point which should be discussed. Therefore, we don't need a necessarily trade-off. It's not a win-lose solution. There is a space for win-win solution with all caveats. That's great. Kat, what would be your one-liner, and then Bob, prepare yourself. It's the most difficult question, which I don't like at the panels, but we have only 1 minute. Go ahead.
I have 2 lines, but they're quick. So the first line is, data is not just found out there in the world. We make decisions about that data, where to look, how to create it, etc. So I think that's important to keep in mind. The other point that's often forgotten in these discussions is the kind of human labor that goes into machine learning, that goes into creating artificial intelligence. I don't mean the programmers, but the labor we sometimes don't see, this kind of very low-level labor. So that's where I would like to end.
Thank you. Kat, Bob, go ahead.
Maybe I'll just pack one thought that can hopefully be coming up in the rest of the event. We talked a lot about the kind of the right to data, the right to your own data. But I think it's important to also speak about the duty of sharing data. You know, it could be considered a civil duty to share your data, for example, in pandemic times, right? In order to solve a collective problem. And I think this needs as much thought as the right to retain one's data.
That's great. I would like to invite you all virtually to clap for the great panelists, to great starting session of our event today. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Bob, for lovely insights, readiness to engage in discussion. And again, this is the best example how rich and valuable is the Lac Léman area with the EPFL, with the Graduate Institute here, with Geneva Internet Platform, University of Geneva. And this is the place where new convergences can happen, in particular in this difficult interplay and complex interplay between technology and policy. Geneva has a long tradition and Lac Léman area in doing it for centuries. And we should continue this tradition. And the best way to continue it is to do it in this way while connecting to London and all places where you are coming from during this session. The event continues at 11 o'clock. I was just alerted by the organizers. Have a great discussion, and we are looking to seeing you, but also seeing you in person in Geneva, Lausanne, and all places where these important issues are discussed these days. All the best.
Thank you very much, Jovan, and thanks to all the panelists. Bob actually teed up the next panel, which is going to be about the use of data for healthcare and pandemics, starting at 11 o'clock. So we'll see you then after the coffee break. Thank you very much, everyone.